Hey everyone, this is lecture 5.1, where we're exploring, why are we like this? Why do humans inherently hurt the planet? Why is our society and our culture built up this way? I am leaving out a lot here. This is a slightly shortened version of this lecture. The original version of this lecture was like 2 hours long. So yeah, I'm leaving a lot of historical elements out of it because it's a really historical lecture. But we're just trying to get the general gist of it. So how did we get this way? We are talking about in this one religious persecution, personal interpretations of religion, sexism and heterosexism, as well as war, namely because we're talking about the Middle Ages a lot, and there was a lot of really gnarly persecution that happened during that time in world history. So, not only did I just give you some disclaimers, here's three more. We're going to be talking about religion, and it is not about faith or spirituality. Really, what we're talking about here is medieval politics. Second disclaimer, these slides highlight the historic role of Christianity as a tool of cultural domination. That is not to dismiss Christianity or Christians as inherently bad. It is just to point out kind of some of the ways that that particular religion have been abused, quite frankly. And then disclaimer three, and this is a little bit more specific. There are some references to indigenous pagan religions of Europe here. Uh, Unfortunately, during the 20th century, there were some enthusiasts of those indigenous religions that their scholarship wasn't absolutely perfect, really, is the gist of it. They thought it was all super cool, and sometimes they weren't as concerned with, well, was this actually what really happened? And as a result of that, some of our knowledge of that particular belief structure might be a little bit messed up, and there's a little bit of not like in a well, that's kind of messed up, but in a oopsie daisy kind of messed up is where I'm getting at. So, uh, the Bell articles posit that the way that we approach climate change can be explained by what they called attitudes of dominance. And this is really this chapter and then the chapter for next time, which are chapters 7 and 8 in the Bell book. This is why I kept anything from that previous textbook, is because this is a very good explanation of how these belief structures got into our modern thinking. And those attitudes of dominance are rooted in religion, individualism, and heteropatriarchy. Two of those, religion and individualism, are not inherently bad. They don't not have a role in a working society. They just have been abused. Heteropatriarchy, on the other hand, the presumption that people who are heterosexual and people who are male should inherently dominate other people, I am not willing to say that that has a place in a functioning and operating society. So, uh, what we're talking about here is so-called normal religious structures. Uh, what we think of in terms of religious structures in our society, especially if you're somebody that was born and grew up in the United States and probably most parts of Europe. Um, those were actually really dependent on the social structures of the Roman Empire, from like the Roman Empire as it existed thousands of years ago. Originally, those original Christians were actually very egalitarian. They very much believed in equality. And early churches, as were discussed by the Apostle Paul, and this is present in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, those actually closely resembled what modern thinkers and actually what some of the thinkers surrounding the American Revolution would recognize as socialist or communist. Now, given those early American revolutionary philosophers they wouldn't have used the word socialist or communist, but they were kind of thinking along those lines. Because some of them were deeply religiously Christian people, and so they were actually dedicated to like this almost extreme form of egalitarianism, which is historically fascinating to me. All of those members of those early Christian societies were considered equals to each other. No one was more important than anyone else. All members of those societies lived in similar dwellings and were similarly fed. So not only were they equal in terms of rights, they were kept equal in terms of economics, and then also new members of the collective were expected to actually give all of their property to the collective itself. Those being, that's not really something that's part of really modern Christianity factors. On the other hand, though, that last one, new members were expected to give their property to other members of the collective. That actually, in a modern sense, would ring some warning bells like, uh-oh, is this a cult I've just joined? But was early Christianity a cult or not? We really can't tell because we weren't there, really. A sociologist would have to be there and like interview people to really tell if whatever that was. The images here, the early Christians, especially those in the original Christians in Rome, did live in the catacombs, which were the underground cemeteries that were underneath Rome. And I am just personally kind of interested with how those early catacombs looked like a lot of the punk rock bars of the mid 20th century. That's just, I don't know. I find that interesting. So prior to the Roman-driven forced Christianization of the European continent, that continent was actually pretty darn diverse in terms of religiosity. Each of those colors there, those are often talked about in terms of being pagan or heathen, and often that classification is thought of as like one kind of unified religion. The reality of the matter is those were different religious experiences. So, right, even on this relatively simplistic map, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different religious entities within ancient Europe itself. And that was generally among the pre-Christian Romans. It wasn't really considered good or bad. It was just kind of that other thing. And Rome was generally welcoming to new gods, namely because they were polytheistic religions. They had many gods, and in a society with many gods, those societies become more welcoming of, well, yeah, we have many gods, so obviously a different society would have their many gods. So polytheist societies do have a general tendency to be a bit more religiously accepting of others, namely because, well, there isn't that one God that is the best, right? So it tends to, and again, all of this is neither good nor bad. It just is social behavior. It has a greater tendency to being able to work with people of different religions is really the gist of it. And why exactly? We'll get that in a few slides. Actually, we'll get to it on this slide. Now, Christianity itself, and not necessarily Christianity itself, but monotheism, right? It doesn't matter if it's Christianity, doesn't matter if it's Islam. Judaism has a potential for this, even though that hasn't happened on a really big scale. Religions that have dualism, which is a sense of this is a good thing, and that thing, those other things are evil things, and everything in the world is either a good thing or an evil thing. That type of worldview is quite helpful as political propaganda, right? you can see this in war times of many societies. If we paint the opponent as being inherently bad, it is much easier to try to convince soldiers to kill them and to dominate that society because, well, we have to do this. They are evil, right? Anything else I'm missing on this slide? We do see similar use of religion as propaganda tool in medieval Islam, that operating in a very similar way, not necessarily to how the Roman Christians did it, but to how the medieval Christians did it. So this is certainly not to say that this is a Christian-only thing. This is a matter of a problem that occurs when powerful groups of people see certain things as good and other things as evil. This Christian dualist perspective, then, how it came to be and how it was recognized by the Roman politicians, actually was what kept and got the Roman politicians' attention in the first place. So, because the Christians saw their God as being good and all other gods as being bad, that got the attention. I think I kind of just repeated myself, but maybe that's nuance. That's what nuance is. So, the Christians came into conflict with the imperial government of Rome because they refused to give offerings to what was the national cult. The national cult, remember, this is in a time when there wasn't a separation between religion or government. That idea didn't even exist, right? Religion was government, government was religion. So, as Romans, and as a sociologist, I'm just talking from the perspective of the Romans now. As Romans, we give money in tribute to our god, the emperor. And that money then, in the government of Rome, operates how we understand taxes to operate, right? So those early Christians, because they would not, and this was their perception, they would not give money to a god that was not their god. So therefore, from the Roman perspective, they weren't paying their taxes. And the only thing Imperial Rome actually ever really got angry about was people who don't pay their taxes. That was really like the basis of pre-modern empires, is we'll leave you alone as long as you pay your taxes, but if you don't pay your taxes, we're going to burn down your village. That was the gist of those ancient empires. So this is where those Christians came into conflict with the Roman Empire. The Christians were not the only ones to suffer in this regard. The people of Gaul, for example, the area we now call France, they came into similar conflict with the ancient Romans, and they also were treated kind of similarly to how the Christians were treated. And so within the storytelling of Christianity, they talk about Christians being fed to lions, and that in all likelihood did absolutely happen. But what a lot of us miss then, if we only know the Christianity of it and don't know the history of Rome of it, is that the Romans just fed all kinds of people to lions. It wasn't just a special cruelty to Christians is what was happening, right? And they did that because they weren't paying their taxes. And does that sound absolutely insane to us modern people? Yeah. But in ancient Rome, not paying your taxes, especially not paying your taxes as a group, that was normal in their society. I'm preparing for a sociology of culture course as I'm recording this, and I always point out when I talk about culture that when you are considering a culture, it's not just the place, it is also the moment in history. Those are critical to understanding a culture. Certainly, people in Rome, Italy today would not think that it would be okay to feed someone to the lions if they weren't paying their taxes. However, as Christianity took hold in Rome, those politicians in the Roman Senate and that were guiding at the top of the power command recognized that they could use Christianity for their political benefit. Thus, Christianity became common in the urban areas, which is quite an interesting dynamic. What that says to us then, by becoming common in the urban areas, and because rich people in that era were the only people that could really survive in urban areas, because you had to be wealthy in urban areas to not be covered in filth all the time and stay healthy, that says, and it verifies that it became a religion of the elite, which is intriguing. We don't often think of Christianity as a religion of hyper-rich people, often. And it hasn't always been. It was just during this era. So this popularity among the elite was more common. It came significantly before it was very common in the empire as a whole. And thus, Emperor Constantine converted the empire to being Christian before most people in the empire were Christian. A forced mass conversion. That is something that, as we walk our way through the history of all of this in the next about 15 slides, we're going to see that happening a couple times. Forced conversions of entire countries was something that happened in this era of history. Well, not just this era, but the following eras between them and us, basically. And I find it intriguing that Constantine converted the entire military and then the empire to being Christians, and he didn't convert until he was on his deathbed in the year 337. I find that to be a bit disingenuous. You're converting the whole empire, but you yourself aren't converting? I don't know, guy. Not cool. Then we skip 500 years. So in the year 800, the Roman Empire had fallen, right? About, if I remember correctly, 300 years after Constantine. And there was just basically an era of mass chaos. The only thing that remained in that society that operated was the church. The entity that we today would call the Roman Catholic Church. They just called it the church because they were the only game in town at that moment. Other kinds of Christians came along later. But in the year 800, what today we would call a warlord, then they were called a king, King Charles of the Franks, aka King Charlemagne, declares himself emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So he takes over a couple adjacent kingdoms, and then he takes over the territory of the remnants of the church, and he then takes on this persona of, I am the leader of the Christians. I am the leader of good, and everyone else who opposes me is inherently evil. Well, that's exactly what the previous Romans did, wasn't it? And it did work for them quite well for a while until their empire fell apart. Basically, what Charlemagne is doing here is giving rebirth to those social structures. And he also then did the massed forced conversion thing. Thus, anything that fell outside of the very strict binary of for the empire, everything for the empire is inherently Christian, thus it is inherently good. So everyone that isn't on our side is evil, And if something is evil or someone is evil, then it is okay to do whatever you need to do to them, including murdering them, including torturing them, right? That is the danger of a dualistic philosophy, is really beyond the individual level, right? You on an individual level, you see the world kind of that way. That's not really an issue. That's just kind of, that if that's you living your life, whatever. But if an entire society is geared that way, that's when you start seeing things that are similar to genocide. If they're not genocide itself, really pretty dangerous things. So those brutal tactics then, through scaring the hell out of people, basically, or scaring the hell into people, if you will, created an ideology of dominance that became highly dualistic and heteropatriarchal, right? So men were in charge. Men are the them versus us. Men need women to make babies. So therefore, and the way you make babies is heterosexual sex. Honestly, they weren't so oriented at sexuality, because modern sexuality and what we think of in terms of heterosexuality is dependent on the concept, and this is really gross, dependent on the concept that women are people. And in these societies, men were the only thing that mattered. So the idea of not heterosexual didn't matter because women were just to be impregnated. And that's really not okay, but that was the society they were in. So this also then reinforced heteropatriarchy, with men being at the top and men being the only important ones. So this, if you remember back to what we were talking about, put into place the high dualism, the heteropatriarchy, and then individualism will come a couple hundred years later. So, and this is what I was talking about a few slides ago, probably could have bumped this a little bit. We see here the phenomena of the spread, right? And so the darker purple, if you're not a little bit colorblind, if you're a little bit colorblind, I do apologize. The darker purple areas were where Christianity was first. The lighter purple was where Christianity was by the year 300. And then in 600, we see a big jump in terms of red, right? Well, that's when Constantine declared the empire was Christian, right? It's not that everyone just suddenly became Christian, it's that the emperor said so. Really, the way that spread operated is that people in urban areas tended to be Christian, and then archaeologists show us that people in rural areas did continue to do their not Christian religions. They just basically, when the priest or the bishop or whoever came by and asked them, hey, you're Christian, right? And they said, you betcha, guys, because I don't want to get tortured. That's kind of how it went in a lot of places in Europe. Now, with that said, it should be pointed out that a lot of people did convert to Christianity willingly, and they were totally okay with that, but a lot of people didn't. So, in this general phenomena of the era of forced conversions, there were just people that kept doing their own thing, right? And we see this in human history when people are forced to give up their religion. It is actually socially much easier to force people to give up their religion than it is to force them to give up their holidays, right? And that, if you're not a really super religious person, that actually kind of almost makes sense, right? You can tell someone you're not allowed to go to church, and that's a lot easier than telling them you're not allowed to have Christmas, right? Because Christmas is when I see my family, right? Yeah, okay. And there are a lot of not religious people that do Christmas, right? A lot of parts of the world, Christmas is a secular holiday. Well, anyway, similarly, When the empire and the emperor outlawed pagan religion, in more isolated areas, they continued to do their pagan festivals and their pagan holidays. And there is an abundance of research to back this up. And this is where, especially in Europe, we see a lot of very quirky and weird localized festivals in those areas. My favorite of those is the Gloucestershire cheese roll, which is, and this is just the most, I don't know, I guess fun is the most respectful word for it. Intensely dangerous is another word. Basically, everyone gets up on top of this hill and they get this wheel of cheese, and I think it's cheddar, but that's beside the point. And they roll this cheese down the hill, and people chase the cheese. And whoever gets the cheese in the ancient times were thought to be, this was a blessing from the gods, and this person would be hyper fertile, and this person would have a very fortunate year in the year to come. And when forced Christianization occurred, then they maintained that superstition. They didn't necessarily talk about the blessing of the gods, but if I get the cheese, I'm lucky for the next year, right? In areas where religions are oppressed, often what were talked about blessings become what people talk about luck, right? That's actually something we see in a lot of anthropology and archaeology research. And you also get a big wheel of cheese, right? So in a time when food was less plentiful, in a time of starvation, a 30-pound wheel of cheese, that's a pretty good prize, actually. Now, of course, then, in rolling it down a hill, people like throw themselves down this hill. There are like broken bones every single year. There might be like really bad injuries that occur here. And I'm sure people have died doing this. But that's the power of tradition as well, right? And tradition and festivals continue very often, even after the religion backing it was eradicated. One last minor thing that was not minor to the people doing it, but I can actually explain this pretty quickly, so I will. Maypoles and maypole festivals were once very, very, very common in Europe, wherein they erect a big pole. It would look like a flagpole to us today, and they have these ribbons coming off the pole, and everyone in the town would grab a ribbon, and they do this kind of chaotic dance around the pole, and eventually all the ribbons wrap down around the pole, and it creates a big pole wrapped by ribbons. And genitalia warning, I suppose. We gotta talk about penises for a second. Well, if you put something a little bigger at the top of that pole, it winds up looking like a gigantic penis. And that was absolutely on purpose, because maypoles were not just a little dance with ribbons, they were an ancient fertility rite, right? And to pre-Christian Europeans, a lot of their religiosity centered on fertility, and actually penises and also female genitalia as well were a symbol of good luck and prosperity during that era. And that was especially frowned upon by the medieval church, so that was something else that got repressed, basically. But the question becomes then, is it something about Europeans? Is it something about Christianity? It would be easy to fall into the mistake of, well, them's Christians for you, or those white people, that's what white people would do. No, that's not what we're saying here. We are not saying that Europeans are inherently evil. We are not saying that Christians are inherently terrible. What we're saying here is there was a certain combination of factors that made those societies really laid this groundwork for troubling elements in our modern society. Other societies certainly had politicians who abused religion, certainly had religious fanatics, certainly had military aims. Montezuma, Alexander the Great, and Genghis Khan. These are all guys that would have done the exact same thing that the European colonialists did, but they didn't have the same opportunity. So what made the Europeans different? I find that this is best explained by what's called the guns, germs, and steel hypothesis by Jared Diamond. It's a relatively old idea. Now it is. This was the book was called Guns, Germs, and Steel from late 1990s, if I remember correctly. The idea here being that it is a combination of weaponry, germs, diseases that were in the population, and the capacity to make steel, and not only weapons with the steel, but also very large structures, including very big boats. That's what made Europeans able to colonize the whole planet in a way that other societies just weren't capable of. It also explains that no, Europeans were not inherently superior, but they definitely did have a military edge at a time when that allowed them to basically take everything over. Starting with guns. In the year 1904, gunpowder was used in China as a weapon. However, those first rockets, they were rockets, were, by the standards of those societies, very economically expensive, right? It was very hard and very expensive to make a rocket that you would get to fire once. What the Europeans were capable of doing, and this does relate to the steel as well, is that what's called the Rhineland region, now Germany, but of Europe, and surrounding regions of the Rhineland were especially, I can't remember the name of the specific valley. Anyway, it was especially fertile with the materials you need to make steel, right? So there was more steel in Europe than other parts of the world, and because of the constant military conflict in Europe, they learned how to make steel weapons very, very well, right? Well, if you do that, then you learn how to make steel tubes. What is a gun? Fundamentally, a gun is a steel tube that you put a steel projectile into, and you use that gunpowder that you might have developed on your own, or you might have brought back from the Chinese. That is a matter of historic debate, but you create guns. And guns are much more useful than rockets are on the macro level, because you can make a whole lot more of them and you don't have to train your soldiers as much, right? So if you're the first ones to get the guns and put that all together, then you can take over a lot very fast. Germs. This would include smallpox, the bubonic plague, tuberculosis, diseases like anthrax. These germs were especially and extra common within Europe in a way that did not happen in other parts of the world. It was an absolutely miserable and terrifying experience to live in Europe during the medieval era. And often when we look at, like, talking about the lifespans of people in medieval Europe, you say, well, yeah, they only lived to the age of 22. Well, that's misunderstanding demographics and understanding demography. There were really old people. There were people in their 60s and 70s in those societies, but they were pretty rare, and the deaths drove down the life expectancy, right? There was just a whole lot more death, really, is the gist of it. But because Europeans were suffering in this way, once they built their big ships out of steel and wood, and they went to other places that did not have this same degree of sickness, the diseases that the Europeans had that they passed on to other people, they had no resistance to it. This is why COVID was so much deadlier in its first stages, because nobody had resistance to that particular type of COVID disease. That's why that first round was so much worse. Similarly with smallpox, bubonic plague, tuberculosis, if you have a population that doesn't have those things, it becomes incredibly, incredibly deadly. This served and created two phenomena. First of all, the original contact with Mesoamericans, with pre-Columbian, meaning pre-Christopher Columbus people, those first contacts, even the peaceful ones, introduced the diseases into those populations. And then the Europeans went back. And then a decade later, maybe 2 decades later, when they came back to take over the whole area with their big warships, what they often found were areas that were completely abandoned because something similar to what today we would call an apocalypse happened to them, right? There was a massive there were plagues. So massive portions of North and South America were just abandoned. And that gave the illusion to the Europeans then that God had created that area for them to take over, because it matched their ideology quite well. And then, so that's part one, right? It cleared out the land, and it killed a lot of people off anyway, and it destroyed a lot of their infrastructure and made them more able to be dominated. And then also, eventually the Europeans figured out, hey, maybe we can use these diseases to our advantage, because apparently they get smallpox a lot worse than we do, right? So yes, they did give those blankets intentionally to hurt people, those diseases, on purpose, some, but probably the more devastating effect on the historic and macro level scale was probably the unintentional introduction of those diseases to those societies that really Europeans never even saw. If I remember correctly, the group of people sometimes called the Hopewell culture, in their biggest monuments can actually be found in Ohio, but it's thought that the Hopewell culture extended from Ohio down to pretty close to the Gulf of Mexico. The reason we call them Hopewell, which is an English, that was the name of the guy that discovered them. We don't know what they called themselves, and they were gone before we got here. And they were probably eradicated by this kind of disease. I might be slightly wrong on that, but I know that that did happen to some other societies. It might have been the Hopewell, though, and I'm sure you could Google it real fast and figure it out, but I'm just thinking of these things because I'm stuck in lecture land. Anyway, though, and then steel. Aside from guns, steel is dramatically stronger than other materials. So yeah, it made weapons, but it also made Europeans able to make sharper, more effective weapons, and bigger ships and bigger buildings, and it was also able to, because it's stronger, make smaller parts, and that can, all of these aid in the, not only the the effectiveness of one soldier, but the ability to make many, many more soldiers as well. Now, all of this does not mean, and this is something that Western society, European-oriented society didn't get for a really long time. Just because those societies were capable of dominating other societies does not mean that they were inherently superior to those other societies, and it actually doesn't even mean that they were scientifically superior to those other societies. For example, the Hopewell people, if you're familiar with Ohio history, the Serpent Mound, down in the Hocking Hills area. The Serpent Mound is an incredibly sophisticated earthwork that lines up with where the sun is setting and where the sun rises on specific days of the year and no other time. That requires what we today would call a knowledge of not only geometry, but also trigonometry, also astronomy, and to a certain degree astrology as well, and all of these sophisticated ways of knowing, right? Very, very sophisticated. Additionally then, and this wasn't recognized by Europeans for forever, but potatoes, corn are plant technologies. Those things were developed and in the New World, North and South America, over thousands of years. Corn is just grass, is all it is. And actually, it's really pathetic. Corn will not just grow in a big field all on its own. You actually have to cultivate it, because if you just have one stalk of corn, it'll just fall over. You have to grow corn among other corn, and then the collective strength of the corn keeps it standing up so that it doesn't rot on the ground, right? You don't see grass that's 6 feet tall. And if you do see grass that's 6 feet tall, it's because it's in a whole field of other grass that's 6 feet tall, right? Corn is specifically created by hundreds of years of very careful, meticulous cultivation. That's technology. That's technology that was created by the pre-European people of, in all likelihood, is the people in what we now call Mexico, but we know for sure it was somewhere in the area of Mexico to the American Southwest is where that originated, and then over hundreds of years it spread up and not quite down into South America, I don't remember that exactly, but spread around North America especially. So then after colonialism 300 years later, we get the modern era, which leads to ideas of individualism. And this is where we get that third one, right? So by the mid-1750s, the idea that the individual matters kind of it came about in history. This is why we saw the revolutions of the American Revolution. There were a number of revolutions in the UK during this era. We saw the French Revolution. There were a number of revolutions in what is now Germany, what was then independent countries. And this is where our ideas of democracy come from. Before that time, it wasn't thought that the individual matters at all. It was all about the country and it was all about the king. That's why they were the only ones that really had any rights. But once we introduce into society this concept of individualism, which is, I'm taking the very controversial stance that individualism and your rights as a human being are good. I know that's shocking. But it certainly can also get out of control. Sorry about that. It can get out of control as well. Because if you only think about yourself, then that can turn to selfishness, right? So that then combined with heteropatriarchy and with dualism to create a phenomena where we, not just Americans, but a lot of people think, well, that doesn't matter to me, so who cares? Screw the grandkids. I'm going to be warm now. All that garbage. So, tying it together a little better than I just did. These barriers that back up anti-environmentalism, they aren't new. They took thousands of years to develop and establish themselves in that idea of dualism. If you're not with us, you're the enemy. And that laid the groundwork for this very ugly modern political polarization that we're going to explore further in the class. And this idea of, you can't tell me what to do. And believe me, on a personal level, I am very much that kind of person. But if it's taken to the extreme, that gets pretty dangerous too. And a lot of people who refuse to help the environment are of that mindset. And what exactly does that mean? We'll explore that in the coming weeks. And then heteropatriarchy. The only one right way to live is in a heterosexual family, and the man should be in charge. And men are the ones that should be in charge of basically everything else too, right? Heteropatriarchy really is, the remnants of it are still in our society, but that concept and that concept of being a good thing, that is a thing of the past, but we still have a lot of the remnants of that in our society. We have the remnants of all of these in our society still, and that is really what's keeping us from taking that next step into sustainability. But that is not to say that these things can't be good for people and can't be good for our society. Religion can absolutely work, and religion is absolutely doable. We will explain that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the following lectures. Just not the dualism of, if people aren't of my group, then they are an enemy, right? That's the dangerous part. Individualism, similarly. Individualism can do some really amazing things and lead to amazing and beautiful acts of creativity, right? It's just not the, you can't tell me what to do and I'm not going to cooperate even if it's at the vast detriment of everyone, right? We're all in this together. Heteropatriarchy, I think it's pretty safe to say we can throw that one in the garbage can. And probably all modern people, if they understand those the concept of what exactly heteropatriarchy is, regardless of politics, I think would probably agree on that one. But they're not inherently bad. That's what I really want to drive home here. And, well, where do we go from here? How do we fix that? This is, the end of this lecture is kind of the turning point of, okay, we're done talking about the really horrific bad things that culturally are with us. Now we are moving forward into, well, what are the things that are going to happen? How are we going to take the steps to help our society be better? And how are we going to make this world a place that we can live in, right? Regardless of climate change. Okay, that is it for this one. This was pretty long, and I do promise you this lecture used to be much, much longer. Okay, thanks for putting up with this. See you later.